not a lot of us can relate with murdering Christians, maybe like condemning them, and then becoming Christian, conversion. But with Peter's, like, he was such a normal guy. He had a wife, and he was hot-headed. He had a little bit of an attitude, a lot of personality. And even in times where he loved Christ so much, he still fell multiple times and denied him. Welcome back to the Come Holy Spirit podcast. I am Daniel Ordonez, and I'm joined here with my great friend Tom, again, as always. You guys can't see this on, the podcast if you're listening, but if you're watching, Tom is very dressed up today. He's got the tie on. I hopped on here. I was like, what is going on? Am I underdressed for the occasion? But I think it's great. I assume you just got out of work, I assume, right?
It's been a long day. I think I've been doing a lot of busy work. Today I did have some fun though. I was able to be a part of challenging or judging these youth entrepreneurs from the high school. And while I was there, amazing food, amazing Mexican food, great business ideas. And I'm thinking like, I don't think I could do half as well as they did when I was in high school. But started off my morning with spilling coffee on my white dress shirt. And yeah, that was not fun, but it was some good humility for the day. But yeah, Danny, you seem so cash. Did you just get back from trivia?
I did just get back from trivia, but are you still wearing the same dress shirt? We just can't see it. Oh my God.
Yeah, you just gotta, sometimes, like I even got it on my sleeve. Sometimes you just roll with the punches.
Yeah, so
I'm still human.
That is fair. I did just get back from trivia, and the campus ministry sometimes will go over to this one. I think it's like a bar and grill, maybe. It's called the Pump House, but they have trivia on Wednesdays. Every once in a while, we'll show up, and I contributed absolutely nothing. But one of our Capuchins that goes there at Newman, that's where they're assigned right now. He also went. His name is Brother John Mary. Tom, we actually saw him at Seek. I don't know if you remember.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I remember.
And we just yapped and cracked jokes the entire time, which is so funny to think about, because I remember like growing up and I would like see a Capuchin, right? And they'd be in like their brown robes, or even like seeing like a friar, seeing a religious brother, like of any order, a monk, like whatever it was, and just being a little intimidated because like they look different, right? Because they have different clothes on. They're very holy people typically. And to just be able to like sit there and just crack jokes and eat some pizza. And there was a basketball game going on the TV, and we were rooting against the different teams. And we're just like, oh, he made so that fun over your guy. And it was a lot of fun. And growing up, I never would have thought I'd have those kinds of relationships with, guys that were literally in order. So that was a lot of fun for sure. And then it's been very interesting coming in the seminary life, just the casual dinners with priests. Or the thing that I just remembered, I talked about last week, how I had dinner at a bishop's house. Well, my bishop actually just showed up, and we went out to dinner, and I had my meeting with the bishop. And then this week, I have a meeting with the Wichita bishop. And then on Monday, I'm going to a confirmation because I'm the sponsor for one of my old students. And the Archbishop of Kansas City is going to be doing the mass. I'm like, in the span of a week and a half, I will have seen 3 different bishops. And who would have thought? And I think we'll transition here in a minute, but that's so perfect today, just talking about bishops, because we are going to be getting into St. Peter, but also him being the first pope, but then all of the bishops as well. And just to think about how that unbroken succession, I'm getting to talk with these people that are literally an unbroken line all the way to Jesus. So a lot of fun.
Honestly, for you to be able to see all these bishops, kind of a crazy honor, but kind of a full slate for you, because like I think this reality of you are a seminarian, and this is what seminarians do, and I think that it's a privilege, a good way of life. And I think as we roll through, as we talk about St. Peter today, like there are parts of our lives that we are honored to live out of the ordinary, and for you to be a seminarian and do that, I think it's a pretty good honor too.
It is definitely a deep honor, and it's sometimes hard to wrap my head around, because at the end of the day, I'm just a normal guy. Tom and I were going on about I was more going on about Bruno Mars's new album, and I was like, dude, these songs are so good. And just to think about how, like, when little kids see me like serving on the altar in my cassock and surplice, the last thing they're thinking is like, "Oh, he listens to Bruno Mars." And it's like even with the Capuchin brother John Mary today, like he was singing along to like Adele and the Backstreet Boys because they were playing music, and I was like, "Oh, this song's by Ariana Grande," and he's like, "I know who that is." I was like, "There's no way," but again, we're all normal people at the end of the day, just pursuing a different calling, you know?
That different calling, I think, is really relatable for us in St. Peter. So, Danny, could you start off with just the life of St. Peter and what really makes him so relatable?
I am so looking forward to be talking about St. Peter today because, as you guys maybe remember, maybe not, but at the beginning of the year, I had mentioned that my saint of the year is St. Peter because I felt like he was following me around. And one of those big reasons is just the relatability piece of Peter. I was hearing in a homily literally last week, and the priest was talking about St. Peter for a little bit. And he said that St. Peter is one of the most relatable people in the entire Bible. And like, why is that? Because we have a lot of these holy stories of a lot of these people, or a lot of these crazy stories. I mean, think about a Paul, right? He used to murder Christians and then became a Christian. Not a lot of us can relate with murdering Christians, maybe like condemning them, and then becoming Christian, conversion. But with Peter's, like, he was such a normal guy. He had a wife, and he was hot-headed. He had a little bit of an attitude, a lot of personality. And even in times where he loved Christ so much, he still fell multiple times and denied him. And St. Peter's feast day, not coming up yet, but it's on June 29th. We also just celebrated one of his other feast days, which was on February 22nd, the Chair of St. Peter, which Tom and I got to see, which was kind of
We
cool.
were there.
Yeah, actually, before I move on at all, how was the mass in front of St. Peter's chair at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome?
So distracting. Like, I don't think I thought about anything else. Like, I'm just sitting there looking up at this chair. And like in my head growing up, I think I've seen photos and so it's so zoomed in and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it's a chair, it's on the ground." No, this thing is massive. It's on a wall with the famous Holy Spirit stained glass window. And so I'm sitting there looking up at this and I'm mesmerized by the accent colors of this dark brown with this beautiful gold, and it feels fit for a servant, for the servants of God. Like that, like that's literally what it is. It was incredible. What was it like for you, Daniel?
It was also very distracting, but such a beautiful scenery to be experiencing mass. But it always just begs the reflection, or begs the question to me, like, oh, like, why do we find so much beauty in these things that are just like sitting beside or behind us in mass and all this artwork and stuff? But it's because they point to Christ, or in this example, like, yes, it points to Peter, but which also points to Christ. And it's so cool to see, like, even though there's all this beautiful artwork, we still have the Eucharist, the most beautiful thing that was present in the entirety of the Mass, right? Jesus himself. And even though there was this beautiful scenery, even back home, and or even in the small parish that I grew up in, the tiny little church that I grew up in, like, we still have that same Jesus. And I do remember, Tom, it was funny, you were telling me, like, right before, they were like, we need to find out where the chair St. Peter is. It's like, that chair looks like that's a really big chair, but I don't think that's what it is. I'm like, Tom, that's probably it. And then we looked it up. We are like, oh wait, this is the chair that they've been talking about. Because I guess we probably pictured in our heads that, like, it would have been an actual, like, chair, not a
Massive chair on the
50
ground.
foot. Yeah, I thought it was gonna be like some one that he would have sat in. There's like a 50-foot chair, like, behind the altar, that's just like massive, resembling the chair of St. Peter, the first pope. But yeah, and as you guys know, so Peter wasn't always Peter, originally Simon, and he was renamed after, becoming Peter, becoming the rock. He was a fisherman, which we hear a lot about. And that's it's so funny, just the correlation, thinking about him being a fisherman, him dropping everything to go and follow Christ. I talk about, like, people having their St. Peter moment, right? The St. Peter moment where they're very convicted and they are like, you know what? The life that I was living before isn't worth it. The life that, of all the stuff that I was pursuing and all these material things and all the stuff that I wanted and all the stuff that I was going to do with my life, aren't worth it if Christ isn't the center of that. So you have this fisherman, this man who drops everything and he follows Christ at the highest level. And even with following Christ, falls a lot as well. And I know we want to talk about, Tom, a little bit about just this relatability of him becoming the rock, but still being broken as that rock, right?
Yeah, for me, like when I think about St. Peter, I rarely ever think about his magnificent chair or these beautiful stained glass windows. For me, it's a lot more about a man who comes across kind of roughed, callous hands, and even a calloused heart that honestly feels a lot like mine. And I think Peter is so relatable for me because I think he's so painfully human. Like he speaks too quickly, as you say, he reacts emotionally, thinks, and makes these bold promises of like, Jesus, I will never deny you. Yeah, he'll just collapse under the pressure. And I look at Peter and I see a lot of my own reflection in the way that like I kind of have to admit it. Like I think I failed a lot as a Christian. I think I've always fallen short of this readiness to die for Christ. And like Peter, my heart is so easily falling into the trap of being busy. And I always find myself shutting my heart to the person of Jesus, but spending more time lighting my brain to this truth of him, like plugging my head in to study about Christ, but never living a life of Christ. And so for me, I want to thirst for Jesus. And I often don't realize that I'm thirsty because I'm so distracted by the noise of life. And the reality is for me is I think I truly do fall short as a friend, a son, and even a father. So it's like, dang.
A moment for me where Peter has a lot of faith, and that's also really relatable for me, is this time where he goes out into the water to follow Jesus. Right? We hear this big old story, and they fall asleep, and all of a sudden they see Jesus coming over to them on the water, and they think he's a ghost. And we've heard this story many times, but reflection that I was having was when he steps under this water, he's the only one that got out of the boat. The only one that had enough faith to step out onto the water and to walk to Jesus. And at first, he's walking and he's doing the same thing. And all the other apostles, I'm sure they're freaking out. They're like, no, don't get out. You're going to drown or something. And he goes and does this because of his faith in Christ. But then what happens? He starts to sink and he starts to sink. And that's just where we have this story, of Peter walking on water, and he cries out to him. He says, Lord, save me. And what does Jesus tells him? Yes, he goes and he pulls him up out of the water and he says, oh, you have little faith. And what really struck me here is it's crazy to think about, why is Jesus telling him, oh, you have little faith, when he was the only one to have the faith to even step out in the water in the first place? And yes, his faith is the reason he began to sink, because he didn't believe what was happening. But it really points to me in my life is, how many times do we step out for Christ, but the relatability that even when we do, we still fail and we still fall. How many times were in my life, I'm like, you know what, Jesus, this is the last time. I'm never sinning again. I just went to confession. Never going to fall again. I'm trusting you fully. And then you start to sink and Jesus pulls you back up every single time. And we have to humbly ask, Lord, save me. And yes, and recognize it's, oh, ye of little faith, because I don't think he's telling him, oh, ye of little faith, saying, oh, wow, you were horrible. You had no faith in me. Why didn't you trust me completely? Because he sees that he trusts them initially there. But I think he's also telling him, oh, ye of little faith, that yes, you have so much to grow in as well. There's still so much faith in your life that you still have to expand, so much faith in your life that you still have to have time to get closer to Christ, to trust him more. And it's just that reflection for me that I realize that while, yes, we do fall in sin continuously, there's still so much more time and so much more life and so much more things that are going to happen that are going to bring us closer to him. And we're never going to stop growing in our faith with Christ.
And I'm so glad you brought up the passage from Matthew 14, right? Because Saint Jerome, one of the translators of the Bible for us to eventually have it into English, he writes, Peter is the only one who walks on the water with the Lord, yet he is afraid. He has the ardor of faith, but the frailty of human nature pulls him down. And that just reminds me of how freaking human this guy is. But I also think that's why we need to love Peter a lot. And St. Augustine says, like, for it was not a holy man who was chosen to be the first of the apostles, but a man who had sinned and denied his Lord, so that in the one who was to be the head of the church, the hope of forgiveness might be made manifest to all. The beauty of Peter to me is that he shows us that God doesn't call this holy or equipped people. He just equips those that are available to him. And Peter had to fall so that he could lead with the mercy he himself so desperately needed to one day lead the church with so much authority.
And that authority, as we see in the Bible, is given to Peter by Jesus, right? We talk about the story of Jesus giving Peter the keys to the kingdom, and where we get even the word Peter from, right, from the Latin translation, Petrus, meaning rock, or from Greek, Petros, also meaning rock. When he tells Peter that you are the rock, when he's giving him the name Peter, that's exactly what he's saying to him. He's handing over the keys to the kingdom. And in this moment, we are seeing Peter become the first pope, right? And throughout this as well, at the Last Supper, we talk about the story of him, of Jesus first doing the first Mass, right? The Last Supper, having the Eucharist. We realize in this moment too, yes, Peter's the first pope, but also the apostles are his now appointed bishops. And it's so awesome to think about this apostolic succession, right? We just saw in person Pope Leo the 14th. It would have been really nice to be able to make it inside for the Mass, which is okay.
That's okay.
We'll get it next time, right? Next time we're in Rome at the Vatican or whatever. But we were able to be there like 20 feet away. And I remember sitting there and having this reflection of, okay, there is an unbroken lineage from him all the way back, right? Before Pope Leo the 14th, we had Pope Benedict the 16th. Before him, it was JP2. Before him, it was JP1. And we just have this unbroken lineage of popes. And if you track it all the way back, we walked into one of the four major basilicas. We walked into St. Paul's Basilica in Rome, and on the roof around the entire top of just the church, they have all these paintings or mosaics of every single pope in the history of the church. And it starts, if you go and you look at the altar, up to the right of the altar, they have St. Peter there. And then right next to him is the second pope, the third pope, the fourth pope. And it goes all the way around the church till they run out of room. And then they go into the inside part of the church. And it's really funny. Pope Leo just got his. And it was probably a couple months ago. Tom sent me a photo and I opened Instagram and he was like, Pope Leo's mosaic looks so, I won't say the word. He said BA. He was like, it looks so awesome. And it's just really cool to think that from all the way down, we have this handing of the keys to the kingdom from Peter, an unbroken lineage. And we hear this very clearly, right, in the foundation of the church, to where Jesus talks about giving the authority to Peter and to the apostles to go and do this. And the reason we also know this, because in the Bible, in Acts, we see Peter coming out, and he is the first prophet after Pentecost. He comes out and they baptize 3,000 people that day. But also on top of that, we see all these miracles that they're performing in Acts that without the grace of God, without God's help, without God's divine intercession, they wouldn't be able to. And he gives Peter the authority to appoint the bishops, and then the bishops to appoint bishops, and the bishops to appoint bishops, to where now today, the bishops are the shepherds of their flock in the diocese today. And it's an unbroken, like I said, lineage. They call it apostolic succession. I was reading Vatican II for one of my classes, and it talks a lot about this, how, the unbroken succession of this. One of my favorite lines in Lumen Gentium, when it talks about the bishops and it talks about the apostles, I mean, becoming bishops, but it says that the divine mission entrusted by Christ to the apostles will last until the end of the world. And we also see this at Pentecost. Jesus says in the Bible, you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And when it comes upon them at Pentecost, kind of going back to that point, and they go out and they speak to the community, this is their first time enacting and going and doing that stuff as bishops, as the Pope, as the chair of the Holy See.
When Catholics talk about the chair or the rock, I think sometimes it naturally kind of pushes us back with our Protestant brothers and sisters. But I hope that we can allude to this idea that we aren't talking about a man who earned his way to the top. We're talking about this idea that, oh my goodness, he's the holiest of holies and he's better than everybody and everything he says must be true. I think what we're talking about is that grace can do so much with clay. We see that the papacy is not a worldly throne, but it's a ministry of mercy. And St. John Paul II explained this office really beautifully. He says, this is an act born of Christ's own mercy toward Peter. Peter's mission is to keep the brethren united in the confession of the same faith. And that same faith offers incredible hope, especially in the Catholic faith, that the truth isn't something we have to reinvent every morning in our own distracted hearts. It's a gift handed down, protected by an office that was first held by a man who wept over his denials. We have this Petrine anchor of stability, but it's kind of awesome because we also have this Pauline for St. Paul, right? Fire for mission. And as Vatican II reminds us, the Spirit of Christ uses all our communities as a means of grace, as a medium, a vessel of grace. We are, in a way, a family in one boat. And I think Peter is this big brother who's simply tasked with keeping our eyes on the horizon when the waves of our own failures get a little bit too high for all of us to handle at once.
And that horizon is the mission of the church. And we also get this in yes, Vatican II, but also for just the entirety history of the church. We talk about the goal of the church is to evangelize. That was the whole point when they were coming down. Yes, obviously for us to go to heaven to be in union with Christ, but the goal of the church coming together was to evangelize, to spread this good news, to spread the gospels to everybody, to literally everyone. And as we see right after Jesus' resurrection and right after Pentecost, they go and, as I talked about, they baptize 3,000 people that day, right? They bring them to the sacrament, but then they also let them know of the love of Christ and they tell his story. And what the apostles did thereafter was go out, and they were sent out and they went to different parts of, I mean, all of, yes, the Middle East, but Europe, obviously all the way to Rome, as we know, where that was the foundation of even the Vatican and everything. And they all went out to go and spread the love of Christ, the gospel. And we have this major saint in the Bible, Saint Paul, who, when this was going on, originally he was actually very against the Christian movement, right? He was a Pharisee himself and he was murdering Christians. And we also get the biggest conversion story in the entire Bible when we talk about St. Paul, somebody that had this hate towards Christians, but eventually becoming one of the biggest evangelizers of our entire history of the church, right? Most of the New Testament, I guess I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the New Testament, because as we know and we learned that the biggest chunk is actually St. Luke, and then it's Paul. He just has the most letters. But a really big chunk of the New Testament is written by Paul. He used to go and murder Christians. And then we have all of these prophets, all of these apostles. They were going out and they are spreading the word of Christ. And we just keep spreading and spreading until it brought us to now, the church we have today. And when we talk about this mission of evangelization, it's talking about that whole point of bringing people to Christ. I always love that quote that I said from this last episode or a couple episodes ago that we had heard from Juliana, that the only thing you can bring to heaven is other people. And the only way that we do that is by evangelizing, by bringing other people closer to Christ, by bringing other people to the sacraments, but to knowing Jesus, to, yes, being baptized, but just letting people know who Christ is. And it's really interesting to think about. You go all the way back to, it started with these 12 guys, and honestly, one guy who was also God. So that kind of helped, Jesus. But going and finding these 12 guys and starting this time of finding all these disciples and evangelizing, and it just eventually expanded so far to the point to where we're here now. And it's a really beautiful sight to see. And we got to not forget that mission of the church is still to evangelize, that our work is still not done. There's so many neighbors, so many friends, so many strangers that have never heard the love of God, have never heard the message of the Gospels, that we need to be spreading this to as well.
But we also recognize the mission. We can also say that that mission is set up in a way where the devil wants us to fail. It is so beautiful, it's so good, and so true. I kind of see this episode clearly after the resurrection. At the charcoal fire, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And in the Greek, Jesus asks for an agape love, a total sacrifice love. But Peter, knowing his failure and knowing that he does not have the confidence enough to say it back, Peter can always promise a filio love, a brotherly friendship toward Jesus. It's small, but Jesus accepts that. He's okay with that because John the Baptist says, I must decrease so that he, Jesus, may increase. And St. John Chrysostom notes, Jesus asked 3 times not to punish Peter in his shame or his humility, but to show him that his denial was done away with before the crucifixion, and that he was fully restored when Jesus asked him, do you love me?
And this is the hope for all of us when we feel too busy or we're too distracted, and we see Peter's second chance, and it's turned a scared fisherman into a man who eventually chose to be crucified upside down in Rome, not feeling worthy to die like his king. And when we stop trying to be the hero of our own story and start being the vessel of his, distraction fades away and the thirst returns. And I was actually talking with Tom about this today a little bit about this story where we get Quo Vadis. And we get the story, yes, in the Bible where Peter asks Jesus, "Where are you going?" Well, per tradition, we have this story as well when Peter is leaving Rome because he's scared of persecution because at this time in Rome they're murdering Christians, and he sees Jesus walking that same road down to Rome. And again, Peter asks him, "Quo Vadis, where are you going?" And Jesus replies to him, "I'm going to be crucified again." And this moment is when Peter turns around and talk about, yes, this second chance, but he goes back and he goes and becomes crucified, and not in the same manner that Jesus was, but again, as we've talked about, that out of that respect, but just not feeling worthy enough to be crucified like his king.
I think something that adds a lot more depth to this whole story is that Peter again asks Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" And the Lord replies, "Peter, if you desert my people, I'm going to Rome to be crucified a second time." And if you hear something like that, I think that it struck a chord in Peter's that I can't just leave the Lord's people. I can't just give myself up for my confidence. It's this desire that if I'm truly called to be Christian, then I better live that out, or else I'm no better than when I was denying you, Lord. And so for Peter to run back because the Lord was willing, and obviously this is a traditional that we hold in the faith, so we can't hold it for gospel, but we can hold it to point to this idea that Peter knew something was drawing him to return to Rome, not for the sake of himself, but for the sake of the Lord.
And with that and seeing something in himself, I think it always just reminds me of like, what are people seeing in us? What are we seeing in ourselves? And him going back to be crucified, going back to Rome to be crucified, like we said, upside down. He's going to be an example of Christ, right? People are seeing Jesus through him. They're remembering the story of a man that got crucified and yes, resurrected 3 days later. And it was this massive story, but Peter going and being crucified himself is also representing Christ in this moment as well. And what it really reminds me of too, when we're talking also about evangelization and this mission of the church, is just how are people seeing Christ through us? And I mean, it's kind of the whole point. Like as Christians, we are called to bring others closer to Christ by showing Christ through ourselves. And it's in everything. I always like to call it's a vessel for Jesus to work through. And I always have this prayer, and sometimes when I can get a little prideful because maybe I was at confirmation class and I gave a pretty cool talk, or like people are like, "Oh, this is so awesome of you," and most of the time, can just be like, "Oh, like yes, it's all Jesus," but sometimes in those times I need to check myself and remind myself that I am nothing and have nothing without Christ, and Christ, I want to be a vessel for you to work through in me, and just allowing that. And when we talk about evangelization, it's actually allowing people to experience Christ through us, and in little ways that we do that, right? Where whether it's, "Hey, like let me pray for you, let me do the dishes for you, mom," whatever it is, all these little ways that we can just show and slow down and ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? I remember there was like this trend one time. It shouldn't even be a trend, but they would always have like the WWJD bracelets. I don't know if people don't wear them anymore, but they'd be like, "Oh, I'll just look at it and I'll just remember
I have
what
a
would
pack
Jesus
of like
do."
30 of them.
Oh my God, we should we should hand those out. Let's bring them back. But I think it's always just important to remember that what would Jesus do in these moments? And are we actually being reflectant on this? I remember we had talked about this a while back, and it's always good to bring up, but it was a story from Tanner Kalina, and he said he had that friend that had no idea he was Christian because of all the time they'd spent together. And he was just distraught because he's like, "Wow, like I spent all this time with my friend and he has no idea that I'm Christian," and completely changed his perspective on people actually seeing Christ through him. When our lives are things maybe not going well and things maybe not going the best, and we actually look to Christ instead of just tucking our tails and running. A really powerful example in my life of this is the witness that I see of Christ through my mom. A lot of struggles in her life, a lot of health struggles in her life, and every time she still keeps her faith so strong in him. She still prays daily, prays constantly, and is a witness to Christ by elevating all of her suffering and her struggles into a form of prayer for others. And I mean, if you ask me, that's an amazing way to see Christ through others and yourself as well.
That mission to evangelize and that mission to evangelize ourselves, even, I don't think can come in winning arguments. We read in Dei Verbum, we evangelize because we encountered a person. As Daniel said, we are called to be vessels. We're not called to be perfect. We're not called to be polished, but we are called to be humble. And St. Peter himself reminds us how we should evangelize. In 1 Peter 3:15, St. Peter writes, "Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence." That gentleness and reverence I find through the beauty of the Catholic faith. It provides for me a structure to hold us accountable when we are weak, to support us, and the sacraments to feed us when we are so dang thirsty. I know that that mission is not just for someone who says they're Christian, but also for those who simply are made beautiful and made good and can call on Christ. As we made that distinction between the Petrine faith versus a Pauline faith, the Petrine faith helps us to be steady, and the Pauline faith helps us to be bold. But both of those help us to be humble enough to admit that we are all just fishermen who have failed. But in Christ, we are made into a rock.
I feel what really Peter showed us, and we get this even from Vatican II, but it's that evangelization isn't optional. I would say it isn't a program. It's what the church's identity is, and it is something that we hear in Matthew 28:19 to 20. Is Christ commanded it, right? He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And the whole point was to not just for them in there in Jerusalem and there in Israel to go and just disciple everyone that was present, but throughout all the nations, throughout all the world. I mean, that's the whole point. That's the whole reason we have Christianity even here in the United States is because they went to all of the world, to all the nations. He wanted to create this, yes, this greater church, this people that were all coming to Christ, right? We have Jesus being the second Adam. We've talked about fulfilling that covenant and actually coming back to save us to be able to open the gates to heaven through his death and then his resurrection. We get in Vatican II, we get in Ad Gentis that God wills all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. In 1 Timothy 2:4, that evangelization is rooted in God's universal and salvific will. God came for us to be able to be saved, for salvation, to be able to go and join him in heaven. And I think St. Peter, being this first pope, really helped a lot of this stuff get into place. And it just really goes to show for me a lot of times that even though he wasn't perfect, even though he made a lot of mistakes, even though, as Tom talked about earlier, in his denial and talked about how his lack of faith, he was still able to ignite a lot, obviously with the help of Christ, of conversion and this massive church community we see today. I mean, the world of Christians, what are we at? Over 2 billion Christians in the world. That's a pretty big chunk of the population comparatively to 12. It's really a beautiful thing to see that it all started, yes, with Jesus, but then these 12 and this one first seat of the Holy See.
I don't know how we failed to mention it, Daniel, but we never talked about one of the titles that we give to a pope in general. Something cool for me is one of the titles we give to a pope is Pontifex. So ponce coming from pond or a bridge. And so the fex part coming from the Latin facere, to build. The Pope becomes a bridge builder, and I think that the legacy of St. Peter should be this bridge building. And so the same goes for our hearts, the same goes for those that are Christian, the same goes for those that don't share the same creed, or even those that are agnostic. There's just this idea that we are supposed to build bridges. And as I kind of reflect on my faith life, the position I am in, I think it reminds me of a Petrine conversion, right? Like that maybe it's easy for me to be very Catholic. It's easy for me to sit behind this microphone. I can speak about the truths of the faith. And I get to wear this label of being called Catholic because I know it's good and I know it's true. And obviously, there's a lot of benefit in a public figure saying they're Christian or they're Catholic. But I think that if I'm being honest, I find that I'm often a man of a lot of private denials. Like in the business of my work, in the secret corners of my heart, I deny Jesus. I deny him and I choose my own comfort, especially in the face of a lot of sacrifice. And my heart grows cold and busy, and I focus on the work of the church instead of living out the church. It's helpful for us today to talk about St. Peter because it gives me a breath of fresh air. I used to think that I have to wait until my heart is perfect, or at least good enough, before I could truly lead or truly love. But I think Peter shows us a different way. When he stood on that shore and told Jesus, Lord, I only have a brotherly, flawed love for you, he was offering to Jesus a tattered, empty, and a lacking heart. But Jesus accepted that, and he didn't demand a perfect divine love from a broken fisherman. He just wanted Peter's heart, even if there were so many holes in the net or how many times he had failed. And St. Jose Maria Escriva writes, look, Peter, who denied Jesus, who was a coward, who was inconsistent, look at him. He ends up dying for the love of God. Love transforms us. So when I feel like my heart is a little bit too empty to offer anything to God, I look at Peter. Christ simply wants my heart. Not the version of me that I polished for a Sunday morning or these banquets I go to, but the real one. And within St. Peter's life, I think that we end up seeing that we are simply fishermen trying to find our way to our heavenly home.
And whether you're Catholic or not, I think you can always look to St. Peter and just remember all the things that he did, but also just remember this mission of the church that we had talked about. And, I was reflecting a little bit on, your daughter's baptism, Tom, and, what it means when we get baptized. And, after they baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, they say you're baptized priest, prophet, and king. And obviously you're not being ordained a priest in this time, and you're not becoming the king of like a country or anything. But what it looks like is, you're baptized as a priest in the sense of you're offering your daily work, your sufferings, your sacrifices, your prayers. And as a prophet, as we've been talking about a lot, you're offering up evangelization and defending the faith and living as a visible Christian as the prophets would. And if you go on to have children, teaching your children and being a public witness of Christ. And what it means to be baptized as the king is, serving others. You transform society by the things that you do, and you're bringing Christian values into the culture, and you're, having self-mastery over the things that God has given you in your life to actually go and utilize that, to go and pursue the responsibility of being a Christian and the leadership and the cultural engagement that it's called to be a Christian. And a lot of times we can look to Peter with all of this. And it's so beautiful to think that he starts the church with Jesus and with imperfect people, though. People that were also just striving for a different level of holiness, but ultimately still had their struggles as well. And my last reflection that I have for today, and just realizing when Peter goes and he's crucified upside down on this cross, where they bury his body is where today they built the Basilica of St. Peter, where the Vatican stands now. And when Tom and I and some of our friends were able to go to the Vatican and actually go under the altar and see right there in front of us the tomb of St. Peter, and I remember kneeling down and just saying, God, utilize me in the ways that you utilize this man. And not in the sense to say that I don't think I'm going to be a pope or anything. That's wild. But God, utilize this man that was imperfect, that had a lot of issues, that had a lot of struggles, but at the end of the day, wanted to love you at the highest level and still fell. Just like me. Utilize me. And with all that, I am excited to keep learning more about St. Peter throughout the year. And, there's some readings about him. Obviously, he wrote First Peter and Second Peter in the Bible. And, just getting to understand his life more and how it reflects more on me is going to be really important throughout this year. And with that, we are always praying for you guys constantly and asking for intercession of the saints for you guys constantly. And we ask that you continue to pray for us as well. This is the Come Holy Spirit podcast. Catch you in the next one.